Well, I think like many crises that cities face, it can elicit both negative and positive consequences, and that it is a rethinking about the public domain and about the city and its effective relationship with the outside world. And so I think that 9/11 quite certainly was a moment where New York rethought about what it was like as a place and has taken enormous initiatives, I think, to really renovate, to restore, to rethink the public domain in really superb and excellent ways. The interest particularly in the street and the public spaces of the city and their relationship with architecture, I think, has been a really profound and good thing. And because New York is so influential, it has had repercussions, I think, internationally. But my fear also is that because of the crisis, there is perhaps a very large concern with security and with surveillance of the public domain. And so, ironically, I think, while New Yorkers are out on the streets and out in the public spaces far more than they used to be, they're also being watched far more than they used to be. And that is a genuine concern about the kind of activities that can take place in the public sphere and who can actually be there. So both negative and positive consequences. Well, I'm an historian. That's my professional title. And I can tell you, as an historian, you cannot hang on to the past. It's not possible. And so, for myself, the key to restoration is really adaptability and resiliency of the built environment. And so, I think preservation is a very important aspect of how New York goes forward. It has to preserve its memory and its past, and it certainly has to preserve its built environment. But I think it has to do so in ways that adapt the buildings and, in fact, adapt the architecture to the realities of the present and the future. So the Doral Stone, for example, building at Columbus Circle, which elicited a tremendous battle, I think speaks to these issues. But I actually like the building. I like what has been done with it. I like its use as a cultural institution and a museum. And so I would look at that as both a good dialogue about preservation and building, and at the same time, it's workable compromise. It makes use of the building within the context of the present and the future. So I think that that's important. But I also think that we should embrace the diversity of architectural styles in the city. We should embrace the diversity of the built environment and its infrastructure and think more broadly about what architecture is. And in that respect, I think we need to go forward by not just looking at the issue of preservation, but thinking about how infrastructure itself more broadly needs to be designed well. Yes and no. Always, what's more complicated than we would wish. But yes, the design quality has been really quite good, and particularly, I think, thinking about the public sphere more broadly and thinking about buildings within the context of the street and the public spaces of the city. So we're not just looking at isolated buildings, but we're looking at the entire landscape of a place, a neighborhood, a streetscape, on how the buildings articulate with the sidewalk and with the street itself, I think has been one really important aspect of design. And we should continue to move in that direction because my concern is when you have large-scale developers building buildings that are just simply isolated within that space, that is where I think you run into serious problems. And I'm not sure that good style at that point makes any difference if it isn't really related to and integrated into the cityscape. So that's my answer there. And I think that the emphasis on the public domain and the public spaces of the city has been a breath of fresh air, and it has truly been wonderful. My concern is that some of the private development projects have been done for the wealthy, for Manhattan as a playground of the wealthy. That some of the architectural work has been done for New York and Manhattan as a playground of tourism. And I would like to think that going forward in the future that there is a concern for the people who actually live in the city, and not just in Manhattan, but in the boroughs as well, and that good architecture and good infrastructure can be spread throughout New York City, throughout the boroughs, and be done for the people who live here as much as for those who are visiting or for the wealthiest members of our community. Well, since we're at Fordham Lincoln Center, I'm going to tell you that one of my favorites is the redevelopment of Columbus Circle and the Time Warner Building. And the reason I like that is because it is a combination of efforts at preservation and preserving the public space of Columbus Circle. The Time Warner Building, as you know, is a monumental architecture, but at least in its lower floors, it's mixed use. There are cultural institutions, Jazz's Lincoln Center. There's a shopping mall. There's a wide variety of businesses. There's the Arts and Design Museum just next door. The Hearst Building is not far down the street, which has taken a Joseph Urban platform and then built, you know, a very stylized architecture on top of it. And that's also done with some consideration of green architecture and sustainability. So I like that mix. I enjoy the mix of styles and the mix in the cityscape. Another building that I like is the New York Times building, again, because it's taken into account to a certain degree green architecture and sustainability. It's a public and open space that invites people in, and so that would be a case of a good building. Buildings I don't like are residential buildings that are multi-million-dollar apartments that are essentially just a steel frame with glass in them that are simply not very thoughtful architecture in terms of the future. They are just simply real estate development. So there are too many examples that I could give of those. Well, I think Plan NYC has been a wonderful and very innovative way to sort of initiate a dialogue and a debate about the future of New York. And although many of its precepts can be argued about, and I'm not sure that all of them will be carried through, it certainly has provided a road forward that has been very important for us to look at critically. So I think many of the initiatives, the public space initiatives, thinking about development in the city and how it can be designed better, including the scaffolding that decorates half the buildings in New York, has been really very, very useful and a very good move forward. My concern is that much of New York has been developed for commercial interests and for the wealthy, especially Manhattan, that is obvious, but even Brooklyn is suffering from those issues now. And as I had mentioned before, I would not like to see New York simply become a playground for a specific set of interests, while the people who live here suffer cutbacks in public transportation, cutbacks in services. And so that's a real concern. I would also like to see architecture and design and the architecture and design community commit themselves to things like green buses and designing infrastructure, designing the actual services that we use every day, and to interest the public and the Bloomberg administration in thinking about those, thinking about arts in the city, as the infrastructure and the services that we use, including everything from garbage collection to right up to the most stylized buildings. So I think that there is much that can be done in terms of thinking about sustainability, resiliency, and that includes security for that matter, and architecture in new sorts of ways from a new perspective that opens up the debate and the dialogue to many more interests, including the communities that live here. And I would add that I'd like to see all of that done in other boroughs besides Manhattan, which could clearly use more attention. Well, I think it needs to embrace innovative architecture, especially from the point of view of green building or from sustainability, and to look at how that can be done with an eye to really avant-garde design. So that is one, and I think we're moving in that direction, but I think we should open ourselves up to those possibilities. And that does not necessarily include megalomaniac height either. I think there are other ways to articulate good architecture. Secondly, I think we need to think about infrastructure, our sewer lines, our water lines, the entire infrastructure of the city, our gas lines, and think about how we can move forward to both preserve and renovate those, and to institute new ways of providing services to the city. And that includes our water's edge, of course, because of the problem of global warming. And then third, I think we need to think critically about public transportation and the public domain, and how we can use it, who can use it, and how we can incorporate safety in the city and security without the kind of overarching surveillance that makes our public spaces open to entertainment and amusement, but not really to civic engagement in genuine ways. So that would be the third element. Well, I think it depends on your point of view, you know. I think for certain groups in the city, it will look like an amazing renovation of the city in all sorts of ways: the built environment, the public spaces, the engagement with the landscape of the city, its green spaces, its parks. There's no doubt that everyone is out on the streets enjoying New York. Which is really quite extraordinary given 9/11 and the fears that that instituted for very good reason. And so it's a joy to be out in New York and to see everyone enjoying the city. At the same time, I think it's a moment because of the economic crisis and the cutbacks in services, the fact that many of the benefits of New York have not been shared out on an equal basis through the entire city. For many people, I think it's been a tough time. The unemployment has been very high. The cutback in services has made it difficult. So I think New York still suffers from the kind of dual city conflict that has been a part, to a certain degree, of its history for some time now. There are those who really can enjoy it and can afford it and are linked on to New York as a global place, and there are other people who cannot afford literally those kinds of benefits. I would like to see the dialogue and the debate about good architecture and about the built environment of the city democratized. Particularly, young people should be brought into this dialogue and debate, thinking about the future is thinking about young people. How do they want to use buildings? How do they want to use the public spaces of the city? What are their interests in sustainable architecture? And in an environmental approach to New York that really thinks critically about urban ecology. So my concern really is to bring young people into these debates about the built environment of New York and to democratize that conversation.